You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast, and I am so pleased to introduce our guest today, Pano Kanelos, the founding president of the University of Austin, commonly referred to as UATX, is joining us. And Pano, I just can't get past the number of institutions that you've served over what is not such a long career. It's a few decades, but president of St. John's College. Obviously, you've been at Stanford and the University of San Diego, Loyola. And of course, we're doing Shakespeare left, right, and center stage for all of those years. And now you've decided to take stage in Austin. How do you do it all? Pano, how do you do it all?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me be part of this. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you, Rob. As you know, your work and the work of Great Hearts and the Great Hearts Institute is something that I've long been a fan of and following. So thank you. Working across many institutions in higher ed has been, for me, a kind of blessing. It's given me the ability to see how different institutions function or fail to function over time. I mean, I've been, between my undergraduate years, my graduate programs, my jobs as a professor, I was a dean and then a president and now founding president. I think I've seen, institutions of higher learning from every possible angle. And that is actually part of what motivated me to be part of this project, right? Having a kind of comprehensive view of the challenges of higher education and taking them very seriously and thinking about the value of higher education and the promise of higher education and lining that up with what we actually find in higher education right now, has inspired me to be part of this new institution, to see what we can do to, in some ways, right the ship or renew the promise, or however we want to characterize it. So, how have I done it all along the way? Just forward motion. You move from one thing you love to the next, and I happen to be blessed right now to be doing something I love quite a lot.
It's true, and I've seen that, and our relationship and your support of Great Hearts and the Institute have been there from the beginning. As soon as I got to know you, there was that natural affinity for our work in liberal education. I would like to go back a bit, if you wouldn't mind, just to reconstruct some of your own story, some of those essential influences in your life that really propelled you into liberal arts education. How did you discover this calling to teach?
Well, I had I grew up in a family that wasn't a particularly educated family. My parents were not. My mother went to the sort of equivalent of high school. My father had less education than that. I grew up in a Greek American family, so education wasn't front and center for me or for my sister and I. But I had the chance, I think a turning point for me early on was a chance to attend a really fine Jesuit high school growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, that was, I would call what we would now call classical in its orientation. It wasn't a label that folks used back then, and was really, really a place that took the life of the mind, life of ideas, books, art very, very seriously. And that for me was that was a seed that was planted early on. I was just kind of enthralled with the things that you could encounter through things like books. And so when I went on to university, I went from there to Northwestern University as an undergraduate. All I wanted to do was read. So I became an English major, and I had a kind of sideline in creative writing. And once you're on, it's sort of like the luge, once you kind of launch down that pathway in the life of the mind, you just pick up speed along the way and velocity. And, teaching seemed like a natural progression for me, going from my passion for reading and thinking and discussing. And so that's, I went on to graduate school and haven't looked back ever since.
Well, and you did tap into the drama, specifically your love of and your scholarship surrounding Shakespeare. I wonder, did that play into what really drew you to liberal education? That is to say, not merely the life of the eye, life of the mind in ideas in the abstract, but in a manifest way, right? The
Yeah.
stage and the stagecraft, as we know, is an embodiment, right? Ideas have to have expression in the just so line. They have to have expression in the character and the characters as they develop in the play. Maybe that's a part of this. Would you say?
Oh, it's entirely. And in fact, as you're teasing this out, I'm realizing it is a significant part of it. Um, there was so for me, liberal education, if I had to sort of define it broadly, it's a process of liberation through discovery, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you have these moments of discovery, and particularly moments of self-discovery. So when I was a freshman at university, going to school in Northwestern, which is in Evanston outside of Chicago, um, I had not really had very much exposure to theater. In fact, I'd never
Hmm.
seen a Shakespeare play in my life. But my freshman year, early in the first quarter, we had quarters there. I was invited by a friend of mine who lived down the hall to take the L into the city, and she wanted to go see this play called Troilus and Cressida by
Mm-hmm.
William Shakespeare. Not a very frequently produced play, and it was being produced at this sort of back alley small theater company called the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, which then later on became a major theater in Chicago. So we went to this theater, took the L. It was sort of fall and bundled up, and I remember very distinctly going into this this kind of community theater where they had a thrust stage, right? So it was sticking out and into the center of the room, and there were seats on three sides, and we happened to have seats in the front row on one of the sides, so we were feet away from the actors. And as the play unfolded, as these actors brought these characters to life, and Troilus and Cressida, as you know, has as a story itself, it's a pretty fascinating story, and you have these great classical characters like Odysseus in it, and I remember just being completely captivated
Mm-hmm.
uh, by what was happening in front of me. The characters coming to life, this text coming into the world in this three-dimensional way. It was breathtaking for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that, for me, really sparked a, what became a lifelong interest both in theater and in Shakespeare. As a kind of footnote to that, that little Chicago Shakespeare Theater Company, I discovered years later, that was their very first production,
Mm-hmm.
Cressida. I discovered this 20 some years later when, as a scholar, I was asked to edit a book celebrating, I think it was the 25th anniversary of Chicago Shakespeare Theater. And they were celebrating it by putting on a production of Troilus and Cressida. So I was, 25 years later, the very company and the very play that sparked my interest in Shakespeare. Here I was now a Shakespearean scholar and editing a book and involved as a kind of an expert Shakespearean with the Chicago Shakespeare Theater that now had this massive home on Navy Pier. So it was a real journey. Really, it was a
Indeed. Full
full circle.
circle, indeed. Full circle. That's beautiful. I'm interested not only in your career as a teacher, which obviously spanned a few decades, but the fact that you got into college administration. At one point, you were leading the honors college there, Christ College at Valparaiso, and as I mentioned, served as the 24th president at St. John's College. How did that transition, that change of role, take place, and how did it affect your sense of calling or purpose?
Yeah, I had no interest in going into administration. It wasn't something that I was aiming for. I was very happy being a professor and being involved, both in the classroom and in the world of theater, doing work as a dramaturg and director in that. I was at Loyola University in Chicago when I made the switch. I was in the theater department there, but I was teaching also in what was the honors program at Loyola, which is essentially a great books program,
Mm-hmm.
competitive program that students came in. And the freshman year, there was a whole year-long Great Books curriculum. And so I was teaching in that, and just absolutely convinced that this mode of education was not only critical for students in higher education, but missing in most places.
Mm.
It's not a model that you find in very many places. And then as it happened, Valparaiso University, which is about 45 minutes outside of Chicago, began searching for a dean for their honors college, Christ College, which is a great books oriented honors college.
Mm-hmm.
And so, knowing about my passion for this kind of pedagogy, somebody who was there reached out to me, a kind of friend and mentor, and said, you should think about becoming a dean. You should, you're somebody, an advocate for
Mm-hmm.
great books education and passionate about it, and that's what they're looking for. And so, I never imagined they would hire me. I'd had almost no administrative experience before that whatsoever. But I applied, and as it happened, it ended up being a great fit. So I moved there, moved our family there, and spent 4 years at this wonderful school and a wonderful program. And then that, of course, laid the groundwork for the next step, which was sort of going to the mothership of great books education, St. John's College,
Right.
And 4 years later, and that was again a surprise to me that again, I had really kind of not a tremendous amount of administrative experience for somebody to become a college president. So I've been sort of using these kind of Jedi mind tricks my way through higher education, convincing people that I'm qualified to do things that I'm obviously not qualified to do.
Well, in as much as I have a Jedi here with me, let me go ahead and ask some real questions. Let me probe a little deeper, because what you're pointing out concerning the honors colleges, the great books colleges like St. John's, are that they are relatively rare. They are in the minority in universities across the country. So, in as much as you can reflect on the last few decades, could you describe for us what some of the trend lines look like in regards to liberal education? Where are things headed? What have you seen? Are there causes for concern? Just sort of give us the lay of the land, the topography.
I would say, first of all, I think higher education has lost its sort of lost its sense of what liberal education means, or liberal arts education broadly construed. And it's sort of my empirical evidence for this is going to these sort of meetings and conferences with other administrators and college presidents, where they'd have these kind of hand-wringing sessions about preserving liberal arts education and liberal arts institutions, and everybody talking about how these institutions are in decline and struggling. But when you ask them to define what they meant by a liberal arts institution or liberal education, nobody really had an answer. I mean, they would come up with things like, well, a liberal arts school is a school that's small, that has an intense focus on students and maybe seminar. Like, it wasn't like the kind of the kind of core ethos of liberal education didn't seem to be in the room for those conversations. So I think one of the things that we're seeing happening in higher education is the very model of liberal education has become so diffuse to become almost meaningless. And so there are very few institutions left standing that I think have a concrete notion of what a liberal education is, and a concrete notion of what the liberal arts means in the context of higher education. St. John's, as I said, is a kind of, I think, still sort of stellar example of this. There are other institutions, many of which have kind of branched off from St. John's in one way or another, like Thomas Aquinas College, sort of the Catholic version of a great books education. And there's even a school that I came to know pretty well when I was at St. John's in Berkeley, California, called Zaytuna College, which is a Islamic great books college. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But the liberal arts as a kind of a mode of learning, I think, has mostly disappeared in the realm of higher education. And if you ask somebody if you ask somebody today, for example, if they're interested in liberal arts education, what they'll equate that with is essentially a major in the humanities. They'll say, well, I have an English major, a history major. And what they don't realize is a liberal arts education isn't about the humanities. Liberal arts education is a comprehensive education that, as we know, with the trivium and the quadrivium, that inclusive of all forms of human knowledge and tries to integrate those together in a kind of meaningful way. We live in a world where higher education is completely disaggregated, where everything is siloed, where the experience that students have is one of a kind of buffet, and a not very well curated buffet at that. So the place for liberal education right now in higher education, the places you find it are very few. And I think it's very important for us to reclaim that mode of education as we move forward.
Now, obviously, the existing institutions, some of them with massive endowments, might have heard this critique from someone, yourself and others. But there's also a movement like that which you are leading with the institution that you're at the helm of, to develop and or build new institutions. Tell me a little bit about sort of the balancing act here. What you hope to accomplish with a brand new institution that simply couldn't be done by reforming existing schools or institutions of higher ed.
Yeah, this is a very active question in the circles that I run in. Is it better to try and reform higher education from within the system, or to sort of on the periphery or outside through new institutions? For me, this is not an either or question. It's a both and question.
Okay.
I think it's necessary to reform higher ed from within and also to create new institutions, and that those are mutually reinforcing. Look, I think that there are several, let's call them strategic problems in higher education right now that are really hard to solve for within existing institutions. One of which is the financial model that you find in higher education. I mean, it's completely off the rails. It's broken. It's not serving anybody. But schools are, schools that are existing are sort of locked into their financial modes. It's very difficult to change course in any dramatic way. Another is the curricular model. The curriculum at universities hasn't really changed in about 130 years. What we're living with now are the curricular changes that were instituted at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, when the research model, the European research model, was sort of imported to the States, and we saw a kind of flurry of new institutions starting, places like University of Chicago or Hopkins or Stanford, with a very, a model for education that was breaking away from the traditional liberal arts model you found in American education. And the curriculum that became settled then is a curriculum that most schools still live with today. The idea that a university is about expertise and research that somehow trickles down through these things called majors, these people called students, that students sort of, like bees, sort of float around to classes and collect pollen or something along the way and then make a career out of this. That model really doesn't pertain any longer. I mean, we're living in a world where the age of the college major is over. 70% of people today working in professions are working in a job that they did not major in college. Most people will have 5 or 6 career changes over the course of their life. So spending those 4 valuable years at university as a kind of preparation for your starting job when you leave is a tremendous waste of opportunity. So reconceiving the curricular purpose of university is very important. And then I would say, in addition to the financial model and the curricular model, the other major crisis we're seeing in higher education is a kind of radical, politicizing of the institutions that are out there. And we all know that it's most universities are dominated by people on one end of the political spectrum, and this creates a kind of intellectual asymmetry. Universities, the very idea of university is grounded in the idea of universal knowledge, universitas, and that we have to be able to think comprehensively about problems, which means we have to step back from our own prejudices, our own biases. We have to be able to get out of the weeds that we live in every day. And so when you import into universities the politics that we're currently obsessed with, whether those are politics on the left or the right, I would say, just any kind of political asymmetry, the whole system grinds to a halt. So
Mm-hmm.
how do we create let's call it a trans-political institution,
Mm-hmm.
an institution where politics can be studied, but politics isn't the operating system?
Yeah.
So these are all things that, you can't address these problems very effectively within current institutions because they're the entrenched interests that are there, the kind of the static quality of these institutions, which aren't built for change. So creating an institution that could address these outside of those institutions actually, I think, in many ways puts pressure back on the system to reconsider the state of things.
It's interesting. It's something of a paradox that by attempting a sort of a type of relevance to the contemporary, trying to be as focused on the issues of the day, we've lost the kind of perspective, let alone that unbiased appraisal that you're suggesting is one of the outcomes, one of the greatest outcomes perhaps of a liberal education, is to see more broadly, to see or conceive of. And so I'm really interested in what influences, and I'm thinking here of the living and the dead, obviously a tradition that we've inherited that might inform this vision that I assume is at the heart of UATX, this liberal education that says, hey, we can't get mired in or caught up in the momentary, this election cycle. Here we are on election day, right? 2022. We should all go out and vote. But in terms of education, we can't fix our hopes and dreams and aspirations and our very notions of a thoughtful engagement on the next party or the next partisan platform. How do we get, and how do you come to understand liberal education? What influences have really been significant in the vision that you're casting for UATX?
So I would say the keystone of liberal education is not simply, kind of comprehensive perspectives on the world, broad perspective. I think that's what we aim to achieve. But the salient feature of a liberal education is the ability to become self-reflective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as we're coming to know the world, we have to come to know ourselves as knowers, so that we can better understand, what our limitations as knowers are, and what we have to correct internally if we're going to see the world more clearly. So I would say the patron saint of our institution is Socrates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What Socrates introduced into Athenian society was the insistence that no questions are settled, that questions had to be continuously asked. We had to pursue things as far as we could possibly take. What is justice? What is truth? What is learning? These questions are the questions that inform the human experience. Now, Socrates wasn't a relativist. In saying that, answers weren't settled, he wasn't saying that there weren't answers. He wasn't saying there was no truth that we should aspire towards, but he was very skeptical about our ability to, as human beings, being flawed, being limited in our capacities, very skeptical about our ability to settle on answers easily, readily, or permanently. So the job of the philosopher was to continuously probe and say, is what you believe actually the thing that you should believe in? And this would lead to conversation that would advance, I think, the advances towards a clear understanding of these issues, even if they weren't entirely clear. And so I would say that Socrates is the patron saint of our institution. Our job is to continue to answer those questions in the pursuit of truth, not because they can't be answered, but because they can, even if that answer is always just a little bit beyond our own horizon.
As through a glass dimly, as the apostle places it. I think this is important, Pano, because your grand strategy down in Austin is going to involve articulating for a broad constituency of parents and students, of professors and philanthropists to come and join you. So I assume this is probably a part of the pitch that you're making right now. What measures of success are you going to employ to determine if you're getting to that approximation of truth, that pursuit, right? That Socratic pursuit.
Well, I would say, the pursuit of truth. So I think the pursuit of truth at a university in a kind of unencumbered or unhindered way, the pursuit of truth in perpetuity is primarily the role of the faculty. So faculty have the privilege of sort of settling in within these institutions and essentially spending the rest of their lives asking questions and trying to come up with better and better answers. For students, though, the pursuit of truth at some point needs to transition into practical wisdom, into prudentia, into action in the world. And so one of the things that we're constructing at this institution is a curriculum that begins intensively in the liberal arts mode. That is, we call our let's say our foundational program, the Intellectual Foundations program, that students embark upon for 2 years, where they're almost exclusively, reading books and involved in Socratic discussion and doing, kind of fundamental laboratory experiments and studying mathematics in a very kind of pure liberal arts mode, so that they can start to identify the great human questions, focus on things that seem to be pertinent to their own experience, and then after 2 years, there's a modal shift at UATX. And students then become junior fellows at one of our academic centers of inquiry, which are actively engaged with solving problems in the world. They're institutes and think tanks, like our Center for Economics, Politics, and History, where the faculty there are a combination of traditional scholars and professors and practitioners, people from the outside world. Students then become fellows at one of these centers. So they've been thinking, for example, about the question of justice, and then they join one of these centers for 2 years as a fellow, and they start working out what we call the Polaris Project, which is their attempt to bring their greatest skills and passion to the world's greatest need. So we're trying to create a curriculum that is involved with both thought and action, theory and practice, contemplation and doing things in the world. Because I think for students who are passing through a university, there needs to be a kind of synthesis between the ability to be philosophical, truth-seeking, wisdom-seeking, and the reality that they're going to sort of graduate and go into the world and be responsible for doing things that matter.
That's rather exciting, Pano. Something along the lines of a practicum, this Polaris, a practicum, an active dimension to the life of the mind, and an outworking that will give shape to society, which certainly is to be found deep in our oratorical tradition, right? The liberal arts tradition. I'd like to know, as you have seen, and you've been paying attention to the K-12 classical renewal with Great Hearts and hundreds of other schools nationwide, how you feel that this movement in K-12 is going to affect your work in post-secondary education.
Well, first of all, I think it already has affected. I mean, people often ask me what inspired us to take this on, and I point to the charter school movement, but specifically to the rise of classical education as a phenomenon, a kind of grassroots phenomenon that has tried to renew the promise of K through 12 education. And I look at the tremendous success, the growth of classical education in all its various fora, and wonder why we can't have that same kind of constellation of options, kind of heterogeneous approach to education in higher education that we have in K through 12 education. So it's very inspirational to me. It always has been. And I think that, for the institution that we're building, our education is a kind of, and it was sort of designed this way, it's kind of the logical next step for students who have had a classical education. Because as I said, the Intellectual Foundations program even though it's kind of in a great books mode, it's really designed to address higher order questions and the deepest sort of critical thinking kind of preparation that we can that we can put in operation for students, building upon knowledge of the world and knowledge of the self that you would have in a kind of K through 12 classical school. We certainly don't expect all of our students, or even most of them, to come from classical schools. But I do think that students who go through a classical school, my own kids are in a classical school now, so I'm really, highly tuned in to the kind of transformational education that it is. I think those students would easily sort of transition to the kind of education that we're offering, which raises the stakes on the education that they've already received.
That's right. It's exciting work, Pano, on both ends. We here at Great Hearts and at the Great Hearts Institute are really delighted with what you're doing down at UATX. Other institutions building new forms and really positioning liberal arts education for a comeback. And we hope that it will influence the existing institutions as well. But we consider you a fantastic partner in this work, and we certainly wish you all the best. You have been with us before at our spring gathering, the National Symposium for Classical Education, and you've generously offered to come back and join some of your other colleagues and scholars to continue this conversation. So we look forward to seeing you in February. And in the meantime, you just keep trucking down there in Austin and make sure that this happens.
Thanks so much, Rob. Great pleasure to be with you for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to seeing you in Phoenix for the Institute event, and hopefully many of you who are watching this podcast will be there as well. And I'd love to meet you if you're there.
Thanks, Pano. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Registration for the 2023 National Symposium for Classical Education is now open. Join us February 22nd through the 24th in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 days of unsurpassed scholarship, professional workshops, and networking opportunities. For more information, visit www.greathearts.institute. Working together to renew the tradition.